Ladies and gents, welcome back. David Johnston having a harder and harder time holding his head up with pride in his new job as special rapporteur, looking into the investigation of Chinese interference in the Trudeau government, although most people looking at this as if it's a cover-up and he's helping out his old ski buddy and neighbor, also member of the Trudeau Foundation himself. His reputation is being destroyed in this whole endeavor. The Toronto Star, a left-wing publication, also writing about this. David Johnston in damage control mode, and it's not working. Former Governor General David Johnston has revealed he's been using not only one, but two reputation management firms to do his work, looking into foreign interference in Canada's democracy. He might need a couple more. This is really squashing the life's work of this man as he moves forward to help hide the truth from what happened with the Trudeau government and the Chinese Communist Party, of which Trudeau has said he admires so greatly. The Prime Minister was aware of irregularities around Han Dong's nomination, says Johnston. Special rapporteur, this is coming from the National Post. David Johnston said there were some strange practices during the nomination of Toronto area MP Han Dong back in 2019, but Prime Minister Justin Trudeau found no basis to replace his candidate at the time. Now, these reports that came out led to Han Dong actually resigning from the Liberal Party. He's not resigning from his position, of course. No, he didn't step down. No, he resigned from the Liberal Party in disgrace over these allegations. But managed to keep his job as a MP, as an independent for the time being until there's another election, of course. Johnston was grilled on some of the findings in his interim report on foreign interference during the 3 hours of questioning before House of Commons Committee on Tuesday. The report attempted to verify the allegation reported by news media this spring that the People's Republic of China intervened via its Toronto consulate to help Han Dong win the nomination in the riding of Don Valley North. Johnston found that although irregularities were observed in Dong's nomination at the time and the candidate did have a relationship with the consulate, Johnston did not find any evidence that Dong was aware of the irregularities, nor that the consulate was involved in his nomination. Now, there was also allegations that Han Dong was making negotiations with the consulate in order to keep the two Michaels in prison because it may look good for the Conservatives at the time if they were released, because the Conservatives have been working so hard to have them released. He needed them to stay in prison, and these are the allegations, of course. These aren't me saying this. The allegations are that he wanted to have them stay in prison a little bit longer until the election was over. Andy Lee, the special rebel rapporteur on Twitter. She's changed her name. That's funny. I just noticed that now. David Johnston was unable to answer why the findings in his report conflict with the CSIS briefings given to Erin O'Toole. He repeats several times that the information he used to come up with his conclusions in his report were based on the information that we had at the time. So was he not given enough information by Justin Trudeau? Were they? And we won't know unless we had an independent, open public inquiry into this, but where this all has to be held in secret, of course. Now, David Johnston dodges questions from Jagmeet Singh on how his report concluded there was no state-sponsored activity against Erin O'Toole when the CSIS briefings that he had access to stated otherwise. The evidence we had was available, or the evidence we had was what was available at the time, he says. And this is where it gets really interesting, and we'll listen to this whole question here, and we're going to get into the next part.
And finally, through the chair to you, Mr. Johnston, I want to point out a particularly concerning different conclusion that you arrived at in comparison to Mr. O'Toole. And I want to highlight Mr. O'Toole raised a question of privilege, and he indicated, and I just want to quote a portion of what he said with my time remaining, that the briefing he received from CSIS confirmed to me, this is Mr. O'Toole, what I suspected for quite some time, that my party, several members of my caucus, and I were targets of misinformation and voter suppression, and that was orchestrated by China before and during the 2021 election. So members of the Conservative caucus and himself were targeted. In your report, you find that you, in reference to Mr. Chu, who was, of course, a member of the Conservative Party and a candidate in the 2021 election, that misinformation could not be traced to a state-sponsored source. So we've got two very different conclusions from a CSIS briefing that Mr. O'Toole is referring to, and then you're stating in your report that there was no clear evidence that it was state-sponsored. How could you have such different conclusions from what Mr. O'Toole received?
Well, again, Madam Chair, I appreciate that particular question, and I've asked to be brief. We did have an opportunity to meet with Mr. O'Toole shortly before our report was completed and did take into consideration what he had to say to us. And I must say he has been a very knowledgeable, thoughtful person about this and has much more to contribute.
Remember that. He met with O'Toole, and he was a very thoughtful person, and this was the purpose of why he met with O'Toole. We're going to get into that shortly.
The evidence that we had before us that permitted us to come to the conclusion you've just suggested was what was available to us at that time. I think since that time, the conversations that Mr. O'Toole has had with the director of CSIS, I think there's been a much greater step in terms of what should have been done and what must be done in the future.
Thank you.
Well, so what did he know at the time? That is always a question. But here is the article that Mr. O'Toole wrote himself. I met with David Johnston for his report, and here's what happened. I'll leave a link in the description down below. You can read the whole article yourself. But the most notable thing about this is the part where he says, "You might understand how disappointed I was to learn halfway through my meeting that Mr. Johnston's report was already undergoing French translation. I was flabbergasted and realized that nothing I was going to provide to the special rapporteur was going to affect his work." Essentially, the report was done. It was already finished when he went to interview Mr. O'Toole, the former Conservative leader. It was already done. He had already concluded his report, and it was being translated into French. I was left with the clear impression that my meeting was nothing more than a box-checking exercise. I shared with them detailed examples of my concerns and how I believe that the intelligence leaks on interference were the result of many years of inaction by the Prime Minister and senior officials and a steady erosion of trust in our security agencies charged with doing important work in our national interest. I was not really asked any question or given any insights. It was a very strange meeting. When they made a comparison of nomination level interference by China to nomination campaigns by specific groups in Canada, I realized that sharing my on-the-ground experiences leading to the team that had been targeted by China was a waste of time. This was completely a waste of time. Talking with the special rapporteur, his conclusions were already came to his conclusions, and he already was ready to make the statement that we don't need a public inquiry. Nobody look over here. Everybody look over there. Nothing to see here. But afterwards, MPs went on to talk about this after the meeting happened yesterday.
As a result of Mr. Johnston snubbing his nose at Parliament's call for a public inquiry, not once, not twice, but on 3 occasions, Parliament voted non-confidence in Mr. Johnston. It's long past due for Mr. Johnston, the fake rapporteur, to resign from his fake position.
And while that sentiment is being echoed across Canada today, and this is the House of Parliament during question period, the leader of the opposition bringing it up to Justin Trudeau.
Forced to remain behind a veil of ignorance by his own admission today. He said that he was not aware of information that the former conservative leader already knew about the government in Beijing spreading disinformation using state organs. This is on top of learning today that Mr. Johnston hired a lifelong Liberal donor who was at a fundraiser with the leader of the Liberal Party just 2 years ago In addition to other Liberal consultants and NDP strategists to do damage control, will we put an end to the act and fire this rapporteur and call a public inquiry now?
So that's even more conflict of interest going down the line when it comes to this special inquiry into Trudeau's government, essentially, and their ties to China.
Mr. Speaker, let me read a quote on the former Governor General. I think we're dealing with a very credible individual, and I think that distant history bears little relevance to the fact that—
I'll save your time here. What he's quoting here is a bit that came up from an old news meeting when David Johnston was being actually offered the job as the Governor General. They asked Pierre Poilievre and some other MPs what his position was on David Johnston being given the job as the Governor General.
Be concerned at all about the appointment of Mr. Johnston, given that Brian Mulroney appointed him to lead the National Roundtable on the Economy and the Environment back in 1988. Should that be a concern?
I think we're dealing with a very credible individual, and I think that that distant history bears little relevance to the fact that he has a very distinguished career. If we're suggesting just because at some point in history he was appointed by a former Conservative Prime Minister that he should be disqualified from participating in public life, I think that is a little bit extreme. This is a very qualified individual, and frankly, I haven't heard anybody question his integrity, and I have no reason to do so.
Okay, let's quickly.
So the case here was that nobody's questioning his integrity to hold public office or do other things in Canada, but as his position of being a very close personal friend, donor to the Trudeaus, neighbor to the Trudeaus, as well as ski buddies with the Trudeaus and a member of the Trudeau Foundation, it would seem to be a conflict of interest for him to stand up as rapporteur, special rapporteur, in an investigation into Trudeau. This is is a big red herring here. It's not applicable to bring this one up, Pierre's words, but Pierre did have a retort to this being brought up in the House of Commons.
Order. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Which is another reason that it is so tragic that that Prime Minister has destroyed the reputation.
There you go. So the Prime Minister has absolutely destroyed the reputation of Brian Johnston in this whole endeavor. Anything that David Johnston had going with his long career has been destroyed. I mean, political cartoons like this are coming out now where China is winding up the wheel of Trudeau and Trudeau is winding up the wheel of David Johnston in this special inquiry, this private behind doors inquiry into what happened with allegations of interference with China. But hey, I'm going to leave this one up to you guys. Leave a comment in the comment section down below. What do you think of this whole scenario? Were you aware of all of this? I know a lot of the media is kind of not reporting on this fairly, so I'm taking the stuff that I could get right from the source and bringing this to you guys as much as I can. Anyway, leave a comment in the comment section down below. Let me know what you think, and we'll see you guys in the next one. Keep on trucking.